Okay, in this video I want to show you the difference between a Cirklon and the new Cirklon 2, which has replaced the Cirklon model. Externally they're obviously very similar. The Cirklon 2 uses exactly the same enclosure as the original machine. Internally the processor has been replaced with a more powerful processor from the same family. The LCD display from the original machine has been upgraded to a full colour TFT display, and on the rear panel we've added an Ethernet LAN port and a USB host port. We just power these machines up. See everything looking very similar so far. The operating system in Cirklon 2 is just a continuation of the development in the OS for the original machine, and they will both continue in parallel, at least until the Cirklon flash ROM is full up. There's plenty more code space in the new processor. So you'll see all these pages look exactly the same, but Cirklon 2 by default uses a smoothed colour font. We just switch back to the retro look on here. There's a little hidden page in this menu that shows you the serial number and the current OS version number and draws some lines on the screen. And the same page on the Cirklon 2 gives you an idea of the increase in processor speed that we're looking at. We switch back to the colour view, then we get a colour version of that display. It's a bit slower when it's drawing higher resolution colour lines. I have a backup file stored in the internal flash storage of both these machines. It's the same file, and the file will take up 99% of the storage in the original Cirklon, but the Cirklon 2 has 4 times the internal RAM, so as well as loading that data up quicker, it's only used 24% of the memory. We're still at 76% free here. There's only 1% free on the Cirklon 1. So we've got a faster CPU, colour display, more memory and extra connectivity. The extra connectivity as far as USB is concerned, you could use for a standard keyboard. You want to use that to enter names of patterns and instruments and so on. Or my preferred use for it is with this class compliant USB MIDI interface, which has the maximum 16 additional MIDI inputs and outputs. So these are all independent. The performance of these is barely any slower than the inbuilt 5 ports, so we've now got a potential 21 independent MIDI ports to hook instruments up to, which really gives you a much better timing than stacking multiple instruments on the same MIDI port. So because the enclosure is exactly the same and the internal boards are so similar, it's possible to upgrade the Cirklon 1 to the Cirklon 2 spec. There's 2 stages of upgrade that are possible. The first stage would just be to upgrade the display and new mainboard. Obviously the second stage means replacing the rear panel with the new panel with the holes for the LAN and USB ports. The upgrade process is fairly straightforward if you have some technical skill. If not, then really you should find a tech who's prepared to do the job for you. We'll just do a quick upgrade on this machine. First step is to take the machine apart. The bottom blanking panel off first. It's blanking panel is the same shape as the rear panel, and they can actually swap places. The rear panel sits on the back of the unit if it's been set up for rack mount use, so your machine might look a little bit different. There's 4 screws in the back holding the rear panel on, and then there are another 2 screws going through the front panel into the rear panel. On the first 2 runs of Cirklon, there's a slightly different design of rear panel that only has a single screw going through the front panel. Those older machines are going to need a different version of the rear panel specifically for upgrading those, and they're also going to need an additional I/O board because they use a different format of I/O board from the later machines. So once we've unscrewed the rear panel, it comes out the way quite easily. We can disconnect the ribbon cables using the 2 latching pins on either side. You just ease them apart with your thumbs, it should lift the cable out for you. And then the same again for the CVIO cable if you have the CVIO board fitted. Okay, so now we're ready to remove the front panel. If you have wooden end cheeks, then they need to be loosened a little bit just to get the front panel off. So I'll loosen them first. Remove the rest of the screws from the front panel. This is a 2mm hex driver for these screws. So the front panel, to remove it, needs to move slightly this way so that the user interface board's PCB can clear that inside lip of the chassis. Okay, so in the original Cirklon we have the main board here, which connects through 2 headers back to back with the front panel board. It's a ribbon cable, runs to the LCD display that's mounted on the panel as well, and a separate cable for the LCD backlight. So we'll remove the ribbon cables, and there are 3 screws holding the main board on, which are posi number 2. With the screws out, I'm just going to press against the front panel board, hold the main board in line with these 2 connectors, and just wiggle it straight up and off, being careful not to bend the pins or put too much force onto the connectors. So these connectors here fit onto these pins on the front panel board. There's another 4 screws holding the LCD module in. So with the LCD out, the last thing to do is to take out the acrylic window. It's held in with double-sided tape. If you just press at one end, then the double-sided tape should loosen and come off relatively easily. Okay, so this is ready for the new display and main board to go in. So the new display is a part that's been designed to replace this type of display in existing products. This is like a industry standard size and shape of LCD module that's made by various different manufacturers. The new display type's actually just a little self-contained with a flat cable, and this board here is actually the new main board. So we compare that to the original main board. We have a smaller but more powerful processor, a larger RAM chip in the same format, but this circuitry at the outside of the original main board, which is responsible for driving the front panel, LEDs and reading the switches and so on, that's been replaced by the UI driver board. So the new main board with the display mounts in the same position as the old LCD board, and then the user interface driver board fits on the same connectors that the main board went into, and the two of these boards connect together with a short flat cable. So one last thing to do before I finish with the original board is just to pop this micro SD card out of its holder on there. I'll transfer that to the holder on the new board. If you're thinking ahead, you will have backed your data up onto your internal flash storage so that it can be loaded straight into the upgraded machine. So there's a protective film on the front of the screen that you want to remove at this point. Just place it in where the LCD module was. And refit the 4 screws. There's a fair amount of movement in the position of that board. You want to bring it down and to the left and just tighten 2 of the screws, not too tight, just to flip it over and check that the border around the outside of the display is even on both sides. It doesn't make much difference, but if you want it to look perfect, then you can play with the alignment of that screen just to get it dead center. And I'm just going to put this protective film back on here just now while I'm finishing the job. Okay, so I'm happy where the display is lined up. I'll just tighten up those screws. And now we're ready to fit the user interface driver board. So the connectors for the flat cables have a little black clip with a little pit with a little bit sticking out at either end that you can catch with your fingernails, and it needs to pull out about 1 millimeter or so, and that unlocks the connector so that the cable can just slot in there. Can be a little bit fiddly, but once it's gone in, you should see there's only a small amount of the conductor. Once it's gone in, you should see there's only a small amount of the conductor visible, and if you press those 2 black clips in, that will lock that cable in position. And then repeat this with the user interface board. Feed the cable in. It can be quite fiddly because the cable will tend to push the black clip back in. Once that's in and lined up, check that it looks straight in. You'll see that the size of the conductors across there is even all the way across. Now this connector here is going to come across and land on here, while this connector here is going to come across and land on the header here. So very gently, without putting any strain on this flat cable, we'll just bring it over into the right position. And then just looking down through the screw holes for the standoffs that it's going to screw into, will make sure that you get these connectors lined up on the right pins. And then you can just press the connectors straight down on there. And 2 of the screws that were holding the original mainboard in, I'll go in here and hold the UI driver board on. Okay, so if I bring my chassis back, my upgraded front panel is ready to go back in. I'll just put a couple of the screws in to hold it just now. So if I'm only doing the upgrade of the display and main board, the original rear panel, this is going to go back on at this point. Because the original main board has its connector for the I/O board in a slightly different position, it makes it quite awkward to use this original ribbon cable with the new main board. So the upgrade kit includes a slightly different version of the ribbon cable. So that wants to fit onto the I/O board. Refit the CBIO connector first, and you want to gently push this in so that you're not putting any undue pressure on the main board or the display. And the same goes for this main connector here. Best way to do this is by using your thumb and finger and squeezing the connector against the PCB of the main board so that there's no pressure going on pressing this against the front panel. So once those are on, the rear panel can go back in place. Just looking inside here, you'll notice that the latches on this new connector here and these latches come quite close, so take care as you're putting the rear panel on that they're not hitting each other, and don't try and force it if it seems to be resisting going into the right position. Just put it in gently and carefully so that you know it's not going to break anything inside. I'll pop a couple of these screws back in just to hold the panel in place. Now let's just take the protective film off. I'm just going to power this machine up. And it boots up with the new CPU and display. And I can just go to my internal storage and reload my data that was saved to that micro SD card I swapped over from the old mainboard. Okay, so that covers the upgrade as far as the mainboard and display goes. If we want to add the LAN and USB host ports, then we need the full upgrade that includes the new rear panel. Also, there are different versions of the I/O board for the Cirklon. There's two main versions. The most recent one runs from about serial numbers in the 950s, I think, and then the previous one was the same since about serial number 300 or so. So the earlier machines have a different board which is going to need to be replaced because the first machines use two different ribbon cables to two separate boards in the rear panel rather than this combined ribbon cable. So if I just take the machine out of the way, so the full upgrade kit will come with a rear panel, new design with the LAN and USB host ports fitted to it. So it's just a question of transferring the CBIO board if you have one, or the blanking plate if you don't, and the I/O board over onto the new panel. So the first thing to do is to take the CBIO off so you can get at the screws for the I/O board itself. And then the I/O board is held onto the rear panel by 6 screws going through this PCB. That's on the most recent version of the hardware. The previous version of the hardware, there's actually a little L bracket in each of these positions, and there are screws that mount the I/O board on that pass through the rear panel. So we'll have two different versions of the upgrade rear panel to suit whether you have the most recent version of the IO board or the previous one. And as I said, if you have one of the earliest machines, then the upgrade kit will need to include the new IO board as well. So this is just a question of unscrewing these posi screws. Be careful as you're doing this not to put too much pressure onto the switch there. It's a bit tight. It's actually can be quite difficult to get at these screws just because you're coming at an angle, but the newer version of the panel, we've put little cutouts in line with all the screw positions, so it's easier to fit the board back on than it is possibly to get it off if the screws are tight here. Just before I take these last couple of screws out, I'm also going to have to take the nut off from the DC socket. That can be done, if you're metric, a 10mm spanner should do it. The nut itself is actually 3/8 of an inch, so if you've got an oldie worldy imperial socket, that should do the trick nicely. Last two screws out. And our IO board should come off the panel. Okay, I've taken the Ethernet and USB connectors off this new panel because they block our access to these screw holes. I'm going to put a little bit of foam under here just to hold this panel up so that the DC socket doesn't push the board out of the way. I'm going to put the DC socket into its hole first, and then paying attention to the SD cards holder. It has two little bits of plastic that need to fit into the slot on the rear panel. Just be careful with those, they're quite delicate and they can break off easily. And then we just need to refit the 6 screws. A magnetic screwdriver will help. These can be quite fiddly to get in the right place. Once they're in the thread correctly, they should screw up quite easily. Just pay attention that you don't get them cross-threaded. Okay, with those screws in, I can refit the nut for the power socket. Just tighten it a small amount. It doesn't want to be tightened too much. If you over tighten that connector, it can damage the plastic body in the back. Okay, so we'll fit the LAN connector and the USB port. These don't need to be torqued up too much, just enough to pinch off against the surface. For the USB port, this little white piece wants to be towards the top when you've fitted the port. I find it easier to put the screws through the panel, hold them in place with the screwdriver, and then find the hole with the port itself in behind the panel. Okay, so this is our previous I/O board with the new connectors. The last thing to do is refit the Cbi Outboard. We bring the chassis back, have the rear panel in this position. This is the network port on the main board, so this plug just plugs in there. Then there's a 5-pin header here for the USB connector. You'll see that there's 2 black wires and then green, white and red. So the red wire goes to this end of the connector. Make sure you get them on the right pins as well. Okay, so red at that end, lined up on the pins. Then if you bring your rear panel up, the excess of these cables fits down into this space inside the chassis here. I'll refit my Cbi Outboard. Refit the I/O board connector as before, and then either in this position for a rack mount unit, or bring the panel round into this position for desktop, and we can put these screws back in. Again, before I put all the screws in, I'm just going to test that it powers up. Test that it sees a USB device. And it sees the keyboard there, so I know I've got the connector on and the right pins. The power supply to the USB host socket is current limited and has a safety cutout, so it's not a disaster if you get that connector on the wrong way, but just pay attention that you don't. Okay, so the upgrade now is essentially complete. I just need to screw the end cheeks back up and fit the rest of the screws in the outside of the chassis. You might find that the screws holes don't line up perfectly in the panel. that case, loosen any other screws that you already have in, and you should be able to move the panel around to locate the correct position for the screw to go into the hole. So put all the screws in loosely before you then tighten them up. And the last of the front panel screws. So with all the screws in, I'll just give them a final little tighten. And that's our full upgrade to Cirklon 2 spec complete.